Part 1. The Impossible Deed. The Mississippi River has always been a graveyard, not just for bodies, but for secrets. In the autumn of 1852, the air above the Great River Delta was so thick with humidity that it felt like breathing through wet cotton. The heat shimmered off the brown water, blurring the line between earth and sky until the world itself seemed to be melting. Down in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, the old French colonial courthouse sat like a wounded animal, its brick walls stained by decades of river damp, its shutters warped and sagging. It was a tired building, a place where bureaucracy went to die slowly. Inside, beneath the sickly glow of whale oil lamps, a clerk named Prosper Gothard was doing what he had done for 30 years, turning pages in the property ledger. He had seen every kind of deed a lifetime of paperwork could offer: sales, inheritances, foreclosures, marriages of convenience, land disputes that dragged on for generations. But he had never seen anything like this. The page before him recorded a transfer of ownership for one of the grandest estates along the lower Mississippi, Belair Plantation. 800 acres of sugarcane that glittered green-black beneath the unforgiving Louisiana sun. A 3-story French Creole mansion that faced the river like an emperor gazing down upon his domain. White columns, green shutters, brick piers sunk deep into the mud to keep the house from sliding into the water. It was a kingdom built on sugar and blood. And then came the line that made Prosper's throat tighten. The line that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Henceforth and forever, the said property, Belair Plantation, is conveyed to Moses. No surname, no family name, just Moses. The clerk blinked, rubbed his eyes, checked the date again. 8 months after Moses Boschamp's death. He read the document a third time, hoping that he had misread, that his eyes were playing tricks in the dim light. But the words remained unchanged. Below the property description, written in the firm, aristocratic hand of the late master himself, was Henry's unmistakable signature. And beneath that, the witnesses, men Prosper knew from the parish, their names clear and inked without hesitation. Moses, a man born enslaved on that very estate, a man who, by every law of the South, could not own so much as the clothes on his back, let alone 800 acres of prime sugarcane land and a mansion built by generations of forced labor. Yet here it was. Filed, sealed, notarized, legal. Something cold slithered down Prosper's spine. He pushed back his chair, stood, and began to pace the narrow office. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet like the ribs of an old ship. Outside, the courthouse bell tolled 5 times, each chime landing like a hammer blow on his chest. With every ring, his dread deepened. The logic of law and race, the very spine of the Antebellum South, had been twisted on paper into something that could not exist. This was heresy dressed in legal language. This was anarchy wearing a notary's seal. He sat again, staring at the signature, at the impossible truth of it. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached for his pen. In the wide left margin, where no one but he would ever think to look, Prosper Gothard wrote 7 words in a hand that shook like a leaf in a storm. God have mercy on us all. He blew gently on the ink, closed the ledger, and prayed that the page would never see daylight. But prayers mean nothing in a parish where gossip travels faster than river water. Secrets, especially the ones we beg to stay buried, always find a way to the surface. By the next sunrise, the story had slipped out. First through the courthouse janitor, who overheard Prosper muttering to himself in the dark. Then to a shopkeeper, who told his wife, who told her sister, who worked at the plantation next door. Then to a field hand, who whispered it to the cane cutters at dawn. And by the end of the week, the impossible deed of Moses of Belair had become the only thing anyone talked about, from Donaldsonville to Plaquemine, from the riverboats to the backcountry cabins. Some called it witchcraft. They said Moses had made a pact with dark forces, that he had learned the old African magic that could bend the will of white men. Others said the widow, Moses Boschamp, had lost her mind entirely, that grief had cracked her sanity and she had signed away her birthright to the first man who offered comfort. Still others whispered that Henri Boschamp had been cursed before he died, that his own sins had risen from the quarters to claim his soul and his estate, that the ghosts of the enslaved had finally come to collect their due. But none of those tales compared to the shock that followed 40 days later. Part 2. The Marriage That Shook the South. It was a cool November morning when the fog lifted from the Mississippi like a shroud being pulled away. Spanish moss trembled in the river breeze, hanging from the cypress trees like the shredded robes of forgotten ghosts. The sun rose pale and weak, as if it too was hesitant to witness what was about to happen. Moses Boschamp, the 26-year-old widow of a respected Creole family, entered that same courthouse where the deed had been filed. But she was not alone. By her side walked a tall, solemn man in a dark frock coat, a coat that had been tailored in New Orleans, cut from expensive wool, fitted to his broad shoulders. The clerk recognized him instantly. It was Moses, the man from the ledger. And then she spoke the words that froze the entire room. "We are here to file a marriage license." For a full minute, no one breathed. The air in the courthouse turned to stone. Prosper's quill hung suspended in the air, dripping black ink onto the desk like slow blood. The law of Louisiana forbade such unions. An enslaved man, even a freedman, could not marry a white woman. It was a crime. It was a sin. It was the kind of thing that got men lynched and women institutionalized. But Moses, calm as if reciting scripture, produced papers from the inner pocket of his coat. Documents sealed and signed, confirming his manumission, dated months before Henry's death. He had studied the law. He knew the statutes. He understood exactly which words could not be argued, which loopholes were wide enough to walk through, which clauses were written in ink that could be turned against its own creators. Prosper searched desperately for a clause to deny him. He flipped through the books, scanned the regulations, argued and stalled and questioned for 3 agonizing hours. He reread every line, double-checked every signature, prayed for a technicality that would save the parish from this horror. He found none. At last, with hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the pen, he signed the license. When Moses and Celeste turned to leave, Prosper noticed something in the man's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't arrogance. It was a terrible, quiet certainty. The look of someone who had waited a lifetime for the world to catch up to his plans. The look of a man who had been running calculations in his head for years, and had just watched the final equation balance perfectly. That night, in his private ledger, Prosper wrote again. This day, the order of creation has been disturbed. He didn't know how right he was. Part 3. The House of the Dead. Over the following months, Belair's grandeur became a graveyard of its former self. The mansion still rose in 3 tiers of white galleries and green shutters. The sugar cane still spread in regimented rows to the horizon. But something had changed. Something had curdled in the air. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next horror to unfold. Those who spoke against Moses's rise met swift and inexplicable deaths. First was Henri Boschamp himself, the man who had once been master of all he surveyed. He was found in his study with a Kentucky long rifle resting across his lap. His head was thrown back, his eyes half open, fixed on the ceiling beam where the bullet had lodged. The wall behind him was painted red. The official ruling was suicide, a tidy explanation that satisfied the parish. But no one could agree on the details. The powder burns were wrong. The rifle was placed too neatly. And the expression on Henry's face was not the slack emptiness of death, but something closer to recognition, as if he had seen his killer's face in the instant before the shot. Then came the Greenleaf brothers, Tobias and Samuel, the overseers who had managed Belair's fields for decades. They had been loyal to Henri, fiercely protective of the old order. They had watched Moses rise with barely concealed contempt. Tobias, the elder, was the first to fall. He died of a fever that came on so suddenly and burned so hot that Dr. Fintris, the parish physician, could barely make sense of it. The symptoms were violent: cramps, vomiting, a racing pulse. And within 48 hours, Tobias was dead. Samuel followed soon after. He was found lifeless in his room, his skin gray and waxy, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something terrible in his final moments. The official report called it heart failure. The servants whispered that Samuel had been poisoned, that his food had been laced with something slow and quiet that stopped his heart while he slept. Then came Father Dominique Leblanc, the parish priest. He had dared to confront the widow, to warn her that she was damning her soul by marrying a man of color. He had even written to the bishop in New Orleans, warning that a corruption unnatural to the law of God had taken root in Ascension Parish. The letter never arrived. On a June evening, the priest was found unconscious on the road between Belair and his chapel. His horse was nearby, grazing peacefully. His skull was fractured. He died 3 days later without waking. The official report called it a riding accident. The parish knew better. Each death had its explanation. Each explanation sounded rehearsed. And each time, the name that hovered in the background, unspoken but unavoidable, was Moses. Part 4. The New Order. By the summer of 1853, the transformation was complete. The parish registers now listed Moses Boschamp as owner and executive of Belair Plantation. The name Boschamp, Henry's name, had been adopted and legitimized through marriage. On paper, Moses was untouchable. The law, which had been designed to keep him in chains, had been weaponized to set him free. But the cost was mounting. Neighbors crossed to the other side of the river when they passed his land. Merchants refused his coin in public, but traded with him quietly by night. The parish elite referred to Belair in the past tense, as if it had already vanished into the swamp. But it hadn't vanished. It had transformed. In the big house that glimmered under the cypress trees, its white columns reflected in the river's dark skin like ghosts of themselves, the new order took root. Unnamed, unnatural, unstoppable. Moses ran the estate with mechanical precision. The fields thrived. The mill sang its iron song. Contracts flowed from his desk to the parish office in immaculate order. Taxes were paid early. Wages distributed on time. The books left no error to question. And that was the genius of it. There was nothing to accuse him of. Everything was legal. Everything was above board. The system that had enslaved him had been turned against itself. But the unspoken question haunted everyone who had ever known him. How many people had died to make Moses free? Was he the first man to beat the system that enslaved him? Or had he become something worse? A mirror of the very evil he destroyed? In a world built on chains, could liberation ever come without blood? No one knew. And by the time history tried to answer, Moses Boschamp had already vanished into legend. Part 5. The Master's Education. To understand what happened at Belair, you have to understand how Moses was made. He was born in 1822 in a cabin that faced a shallow bayou where dragonflies hovered over black water and winter fog lay low like a second roof. His mother, Patience, ran the main house linen room and taught him that a house says more about its master than a sermon. If you want to know a man, fold his shirts and count how often he stains the cuffs. His father's name never appeared in Belair's books. Only a dash, a silence the size of a life. Moses learned early that everything worth having on a plantation had to be stolen without being missed. Not goods, glances. Glances at slates covered in Latin verbs as the Boschamp children recited on the gallery. Glances at the carpenter's planes, the millwright's wrenches, the way a foreman set a plumb line and trusted gravity to hum the truth. He memorized the tutor's sums through a glass pane, then traced them in dust with a stick. He watched the sky too, how storm bands on the Gulf showed themselves 2 days before the river rose, how a line of white herons over marsh meant a dry spell, how night air, if it smelled of iron, promised a bad dawn. Before he was 15, he could sharpen a saw so clean the teeth sang, square a sill beam without a second measure, and name the month's profits within a margin of a single hogshead. Boys his age learned to avoid the whip. Moses learned to avoid waste. Henri noticed. He always noticed things that made him money. He brought Moses closer, first by necessity, then by habit. The boy knew when to speak, and, more valuable, when to keep a number in his head until asked. He became a driver, then a mill hand trusted near the red-hot rollers, then the keeper of small keys, the kind of promotion that isn't titled but opens rooms other men never see. At the big table, planters spoke of cotton prices and the compromise of 1850. On the back steps afterward, Henri would repeat a point he had just argued in cleaner language, as if hearing it improved it. And later in the study, he would find the figure already copied into a ledger in the neat, unassuming hand of the enslaved man who had made him sound intelligent hours before. Henri told himself he was using a tool. He did not yet understand that the tool had learned the carpenter. Part 6. The house that counted everything. Belair's main house was 3 stories of arithmetic. A ground floor of service corridors and storerooms where salt pork hung from hooks. A second floor of rooms arranged in pairs like matched numbers. A third of smaller chambers where summer winds turned fretful and sweet. Louisa, who had nursed Henri as an infant and now ruled the household with quiet iron, knew every hinge that creaked and every board that swallowed footfall. Old Jacques, the cook, measured time by reductions, a sauce, a rumor, a life, all thickened the same way. Margot, whose mother Louisa had taught to starch collars and secrets, became Celeste's maid. It gave her access to a narrower kingdom, glass vials with Paris labels, lace pinned like small wings to a dressing board, the scent of orange flower water that clung to the mistress and meant she had not slept. From such small territories come great histories. Margot heard whispers before they grew teeth. When Celeste arrived in 1845, a girl of 19 with a waist like a truce and eyes that refused to yield, she brought a dowry of reputation and relief. Her father's gambling had carved holes in an old Creole name. Marriage to Henri patched them. She brought manners to the big house the way a pianist brings order to a parlor. But in private, the distances were immediate. A polite wife who ate like a bird and spoke in exact, cooled French. A husband who drank claret slowly, counted slowly, and loved his machines more reliably than people. In that gap between them, silence settled. And silence is a garden where other things grow. Part 7. The arithmetic of pain. Out in the fields, authority wore a rawhide belt and the smell of horse sweat. Tobias Greenleaf and his younger brother Samuel weren't from Ascension Parish. They were small farm men who had discovered their talent for command in other people's pain. Tobias was a rule carved in hickory, declarative, corrective, incapable of doubt. Samuel had the same jaw, but not the same certainty. He preferred the shapes of orders to their consequences. Officially, the Greenleafs commanded the hands. In practice, Moses controlled the flow, who was sent to the ditch on a day when ditches mattered, who ran the wagons when the track was dry, who cut cane at the high ridges because the soil would be poorer next year. Henri wanted the good stock saved. The overseers hated the way the enslaved man's suggestions sounded like facts. They hated how Henri listened. Moses rarely looked at them when he spoke. He looked at the work. Part 8. The Last Supper. The summer of 1852 bled heat like an open wound. Even by Louisiana standards, June pressed down on Ascension Parish with the weight of a living thing. Thick, airless, unmoving. The cane leaves lay flat, too tired to whisper. The dogs panted and refused to bark. By evening, even the river seemed to slow, its brown surface glazed with a kind of waiting. Inside the great house, the day followed its usual choreography. Meals, ledgers, silence. But beneath the routines, something had been shifting for months, too quiet to be seen, too steady to be stopped. That day, Henri had spent the morning with Moses, reviewing figures for the next planting season. The study smelled of heat, ink, and damp paper. The windows stood open toward the river, but the air that came through was dead. They talked of land, debt, and weather, the three gods of the South. Henri spoke of buying the Dupré tract upriver. Moses noted quietly that the soil was poor, the irrigation costly. Henri disagreed. He always disagreed first as a reflex, then often circled back to Moses's opinion an hour later, pretending the idea was his own. By late afternoon, Henri dismissed him with a wave. "We'll finalize tomorrow," he said. The same words he always said before a decision he didn't want to make that day. Moses nodded, left the room, and closed the door behind him with the quiet finality of someone sealing a tomb. Celeste did not appear for dinner. She had complained of headaches again, confining herself to her chambers with only her maid Margot for company. Henri barely noticed. He ate alone, as he often did when business crowded his mind. At 7, he asked for supper to be brought to his study. Cold chicken, bread, cheese, and his favorite claret, the 1847 bottle from Bordeaux. Louisa prepared it herself. Old Jacques laid the food. Margot carried it upstairs, knocked once, and entered only far enough to place the tray upon the table. Henri's voice came from behind his desk, low and distracted. "Leave it there," he said. The door clicked shut. Margot would later swear she heard him humming. A small, contented sound that did not belong in that house. Part 9. The sound that split the silence. At 9:30, Tobias Greenleaf was making his rounds outside. The humidity turned his shirt to paste, and he cursed softly as he passed the house. Through the open shutters of the second-floor study, he saw a light still burning. It struck him as typical. Henri worked too hard, drank too little, and thought too much. Tobias spat into the dirt and moved on. That detail, the light, would later become the cornerstone of every theory, the first sentence of every whispered retelling. Inside, the house slept uneasily. The servants in the rear quarters had already gone to their pallets. Celeste, still awake, sat before her mirror, combing her hair, though she could not feel the strands. When Margot brought her tea, she asked a single question. "Is the study light still on?" "Yes, ma'am," Margot said. Celeste nodded and said nothing more. At 11:45, the stillness of the plantation cracked. Louisa, half dreaming in her small room off the gallery, heard it first, a thud, heavy and final, followed by a sound that could have been wind or could have been breath leaving a body. She rose, lit a candle, and followed her instincts toward the study. The flame trembled as she climbed the stairs. The door stood slightly ajar. That more than the noise stopped her heart. Henri never left it open. She pushed it wider. The lamp still burned. The air smelled of gunpowder and wine. Moses Boschamp sat behind his desk, his head thrown back, the Kentucky long rifle resting across his lap. The wall behind him was painted red. His eyes were half open, fixed on the ceiling beam where the bullet had lodged. The bottle of claret stood nearly empty. Louisa's scream tore through the house. Feet pounded the stairs. Doors flew open. In moments, the study filled. Celeste, Moses, Margot, Tobias, Samuel, and two terrified servants crowding the threshold. The scene was a tableau of nightmare. The master's blood drying on wallpaper. The rifle gleaming across his knees. The silence of a room that had run out of air. Part 10. The Doctor's Doubt. Dr. Matthias Fentress arrived just after 1 in the morning, a lantern swinging from his carriage, the smell of camphor following him like a shadow. He examined the body, made notes in a small leather book, and spoke in the careful tone of a man measuring every word. "Yes," he said at last. "Suicide. Likely within the last 3 hours." But later, in his private papers, Fentress would record what he didn't say aloud. The powder burns were shallow. For the shot to have entered beneath the chin, the blast should have blackened both hands. It hadn't. The rifle lay across the lap too neatly for a man who had just pulled the trigger. The bottle was nearly drained, yet Henri was known to drink only 2 glasses. And his expression, though slackened by death, seemed not empty but aware, as though he had recognized the person standing before him in the instant before the shot. The official verdict was tidy: suicide in a state of melancholy and intoxication. It was the answer the parish needed. No scandal, no crime, no spectacle. But it didn't balance for everyone. Tobias muttered that Henri had been planning expansions, not mourning failures. Armand Boschamp, Henry's brother, arrived from Baton Rouge and confirmed the estate's accounts were healthy, the ledgers neat, the debts manageable. Louisa whispered to anyone who would listen that the master was not the kind of man to leave his affairs unfinished. Dr. Fentress, for his part, wrote a separate sealed report for the parish coroner, one that contradicted nearly every point of the official verdict. That report would disappear within the month. Part 11. The Funeral and the Locket. The funeral came on June 22nd beneath a sky white with heat. The air smelled of sugar and rot. Father Dominique Leblanc spoke of Henry's virtues, his devotion to duty, and his unexplained passing, but he did not speak the word suicide. That too was part of the mercy. Celeste stood in black lace beside the coffin, her face unreadable. Moses stood a respectful distance away, his head bowed. Louisa, who had known both since youth, swore later that she saw their eyes meet just once across the grave, and that in that single look, something passed between them that should never have been spoken aloud. That night, when Margot undressed her mistress, she noticed a new locket around Celeste's throat. It was small, gold, old-fashioned. When she asked about it, Celeste said softly, "It belonged to my grandmother." Inside that locket, though Margot could not know it, was a folded scrap of paper and a single curl of dark hair. On the paper, written in a hand both familiar and forbidden, were 7 words. "What we have begun cannot be undone." Part 12. The New Master. After the funeral, Armand Boschamp returned to Baton Rouge. He left the estate under current arrangements. No one knew exactly what that meant, but everyone understood who was giving the orders now. The overseers still barked commands in the fields, but Moses now handled the accounts, the shipments, the correspondence. He spoke softly, worked tirelessly, and did nothing that could be called insubordination. And yet, every order he issued, every letter he signed in Celeste's name, every decision he made in the master's office, slowly rearranged the house of Belair. By July, Louisa realized something chilling. The plantation was functioning exactly as before. Same schedules, same profits, same efficiency. Only now, no one quite remembered who was in charge. The system hadn't collapsed. It had simply changed hands. One evening, as Louisa tidied the study, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. The rifle, The same long gun that had killed Henri was back on its hooks above the desk. Cleaned, oiled, ready. She remembered clearly that Sheriff Thibodeau had taken it as evidence. She mentioned this to Moses. He told her that Armand had arranged its return before leaving for Baton Rouge. It was a plausible answer. But when Louisa looked up at the polished barrel glinting in the lamplight, she could not shake the feeling that it was waiting, as if the weapon itself knew it would be needed again. The plantation slept that night under a silence so deep the river seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the dark, a man who had been born a possession began the slow, methodical process of possessing everything. Part 13. The body count rises. Order built on silence never lasts. In early 1853, people began dying again. Not the poor, not the sick, but those who had known too much. First was Father LeBlanc, the priest who had condemned their union. He fell from his horse during a sermon trip and broke his neck. Then Josiah, a freedman who had once worked in Henry's office and hinted that the will had been forged. He vanished on his way to Baton Rouge. Then old Jacques, who one night complained of stomach pain and never woke again. Each death was explained, recorded, forgotten. Each brought Belair a little more peace. And through it all, Moses's name remained untarnished. No witness, no weapon, no proof. Just a perfect symmetry of timing and silence. Dr. Fentress had not slept well since the night he examined Henry's body. The scene had never left him. The rifle too neat, the wound too clean, the expression on the dead man's face as if he had recognized his killer. Now, as one death followed another, Fentress began to suspect what others dared not, that these were not coincidences of fate, but the footprints of a mind too careful to be caught. He made notes in a private journal. The fever that killed Tobias, the heart that failed Samuel's field hand, the priest's broken neck. He saw a pattern forming in ink and illness. But fear silenced even men of science. When the sheriff came to visit Belair, Fentress found an excuse to stay home. When Celeste sent for him to treat her fainting spells, he refused. "I am not the doctor for ghosts," he muttered to himself. Part 14. The Siege. By the spring of 1854, Belair was no longer part of Louisiana, not in spirit, not in law, not in conscience. The parish officials still listed it in their ledgers, still collected its taxes, but everyone knew the truth. Belair was now a kingdom of two. Every soul on the estate served only one will, a will written in perfect ink and sealed with a widow's ring. The rest of Ascension Parish had begun to circle. They could not tolerate the miracle that stood before them. A man once enslaved, now lord of the grandest estate in the Delta. Every power that slavery had promised to protect, the church, the law, the bloodlines, had been mocked by the living proof of Moses Boschamp. And so quietly, methodically, the world decided that Belair must be erased. The first strike came not with torches, but with lawyers. In March 1854, a young attorney from New Orleans arrived with an entourage and a sealed order from the civil court. He claimed to represent Henri Boschamp's distant cousins in France, and his mission was simple: to overturn the will that had made Celeste, and by extension Moses, the legal owners of Belair. His argument was a masterpiece of Southern hypocrisy. The late Monsieur Boschamp was not of sound mind at the time of his death. He was under the influence of a dangerous Negro whose proximity compromised both his will and his widow. The parish nodded along. The court smelled blood. But Moses was already 2 steps ahead. He summoned a New Orleans lawyer of impeccable repute and placed in his hands every receipt, every signature, every sealed document that could prove the estate's legality. Then he said quietly, "I want them to drown in the very law they worship." The hearing was set for September. Until then, both sides prepared for war, not with soldiers, but with paper, coin, and influence. Part 15. The Fire and the Shot. Before the trial could begin, the first spark came literally. On a humid April night, the barn at Belair caught fire. It began in 3 separate corners at once. Within minutes, the flames devoured the hayloft, the stables, and a shipment of sugar bound for New Orleans. The blaze glowed red across the river, painting the fog like blood. Moses was first to arrive. He ordered the men to form a line from the well, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Celeste stood on the gallery above, unmoving, her face ghost pale in the firelight. By dawn, the barn was gone, but the mansion still stood. When the sheriff came to investigate, he found 3 charred footprints leading away from the ruins. They tried, Moses said, watching the smoke drift toward heaven. They'll try again. The second strike came in May. Moses was riding back from the river road when a musket cracked from the cypress grove. The bullet tore through his coat, grazing his shoulder before burying itself in the saddle. His horse reared screaming. Moses dismounted calmly, examined the wound, and stared into the trees. He said nothing. But the next morning, armed guards arrived from New Orleans, men loyal to him alone. Belair became a fortress. Every night, torches burned along the road. Every door was locked before sunset. The fields glowed with the light of hired rifles instead of fireflies. Neighbors whispered that Belair had become a kingdom of the damned. But the truth was simpler. It had become a fortress built by fear and maintained by law. Part 16. The Collapse of the Lawsuit. By August 1854, the case was ready for court. The attorney arrived in Baton Rouge with boxes of papers and a list of witnesses. But the night before the deposition, his hotel room was broken into. 2 men beat him savagely and took every document related to the case. He survived barely, but his jaw was shattered and his left eye blinded. The assailants were never found. With his evidence destroyed and his health ruined, the attorney withdrew the case. 3 weeks later, the court dismissed the challenge, declaring the will of Moses Boschamp fully valid. On paper, Moses and Celeste stood untouchable. But in the hearts of the parish, they had become something unholy. Not masters, not freedmen, but a warning of what happens when the laws of blood are broken. Part 17. The Meeting at Chevalier's Hall. That autumn, as the heat gave way to rain, the planters of Ascension gathered in secret at Colonel Auguste Chevalier's Hall. 23 men attended, lawyers, merchants, overseers, and 1 priest. They spoke for hours, their voices muffled by thunder. "We can't allow this to stand," said one. "If a Negro can own Belair, what stops the rest from believing they can own us?" They discussed legal recourse, tax harassment, even arson. Finally, Chevalier slammed his fist on the table. "Enough of law," he said. "This will be settled in the old way." They formed a committee of 3, a discreet arrangement, never written down, to ensure Belair's end. Their goal: make Moses's death look like an accident. But Moses had already heard. Belair's walls had ears. Servants loyal to him, bought, freed, or terrified, carried whispers back from every corner of the parish. Within 2 nights, one of the 3 committee men was dead, shot through his dining room window as he poured his brandy. The coroner called it a hunting accident. The message was clear: I know who you are. 2 weeks later, another fled the parish entirely. The third, Colonel Chevalier himself, fell ill that winter with the same violent stomach cramps that had claimed Tobias Greenleaf. He was dead within 3 days. When Dr. Fentress examined the body, he wrote in his notes, "Symptoms consistent with cholera or poison." Part 18. The Unspoken Victory. By early 1855, the siege of Belair was over. No more lawsuits. No more attacks. No more challenges. Everyone who had raised a hand or even a whisper against Moses Boschamp was gone, vanished or silent. He had done the unthinkable. He had outlasted them all. But victory came at a price no ledger could balance. Belair's gates were now guarded night and day. The plantation's trade routes ran through strangers from New Orleans, not neighbors from Ascension. The laughter of its workers had been replaced by quiet obedience. Even the songs at dusk, the sorrowful hymns of the enslaved, had ceased. Belair was profitable, efficient, and utterly dead inside. Celeste began to fade soon after. Her health wavered. Her speech grew faint. She slept in long stretches, waking only to stare at the horizon as if listening to voices no one else could hear. When Dr. Fentress came, Moses met him at the door. "She is resting," he said. "There is nothing you can do." From that day, no one but Moses entered her room. Louisa said she sometimes heard Celeste talking to herself, whispering names, apologizing to people who were long dead. By Christmas, her laughter had stopped entirely. Part 19, The Freedom Papers. In October 1859, Celeste Boschamp died. The doctor wrote melancholia and wasting disease on the certificate. Moses did not attend her funeral. He sent a wreath of white magnolia and a note that read simply, "May she find the peace she sought in life." The entire parish took it as a confession, though no one could say of what. 2 weeks later, Moses called the remaining servants and laborers to the front steps of the house. There were 73 of them left. He read from a document stamped and sealed in Baton Rouge, their freedom papers. Every man, woman, and child on Belair was free to go. The shock rippled through them like thunder. Some wept. Some fled that very night. Others stayed, not knowing where to begin again. When Louisa asked him why, Moses replied, "Because I refused to be master of the thing that made me a monster." By freeing them, he had destroyed the machine that kept Belair alive. Within a month, the fields went wild. The mill went cold. The estate that had once been the jewel of Ascension Parish became a skeleton of its former glory. Part 20, The Last Conversation. In December 1859, Moses summoned Dr. Fentress to the house one final time. The doctor found him seated in Henry's old study, the same room where the first blood had been spilled. Papers covered the desk, deeds, contracts, letters. The rifle still hung above, polished and ready. Moses poured 2 glasses of brandy and gestured to a chair. "You've wondered," he said, "what really happened here. You've written notes in secret, avoided my eyes, prayed for my absence. I respect that." Fentress said nothing. Moses continued, his tone calm and measured. "I did what your world forced me to do. You made a cage, and I learned how to open it from the inside. Every man who died was part of the price. Do I regret it? Only that freedom feels no different than the chains I broke." He leaned forward. "Tell me, doctor, if you could end an injustice only by committing another, would you do it?" Fentress hesitated. "I don't know." Moses smiled faintly. "That's the right answer. Anyone certain is already damned." That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Part 21, The Vanishing. On January 12, 1860, a field worker noticed the front door of Belair standing open. Inside, the rooms were immaculate. The study smelled faintly of smoke and ink.